In 1942, after 3 years of war, German control in Europe reached its greatest extent, from the Arctic Circle to Africa, and from the English Channel to the Volga. But all that changed in 1943, a year sometimes called Das Vergessenkriegjahr, or the Forgotten Year of the War. As the new year begins, the Red Army tightens its grip on surrounded German forces in Stalingrad, who surrender in February. This marks the first time an entire German field army has laid down its arms, and it won't be the last. Stalingrad is a major turning point in the war, but 1943 has just begun, and the rest of the year will see more dramatic setbacks for the Axis in the European theater. The very next major Allied blow against Germany will draw some direct comparisons to Stalingrad-Tunisgrad. By late 1942, Axis forces in North Africa are on the back foot. After Rommel's decisive defeat at the Battle of El Alamein in November, British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army chases the newly renamed German-Italian Panzer Army back across the Libyan desert. Shortly afterward, Anglo-American troops under General Dwight D. Eisenhower landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. The goal for both the Axis and Allied armies is Tunisia, home to the last major Axis ports of Béziers and Tunis. For Rommel, shorter supply lines in Tunisia offer a chance to replenish his army and perhaps bring it closer to being an effective force. But 2,500 kilometers of non-stop retreat has unsettled the German high command. In Berlin, the general staff make arrangements for his replacement and continually ask Rommel to make much-needed sick leave. He refuses for the time being. The Allies are also making plans. In January, Roosevelt and Churchill-Stalin refuses their invitation. Meet at Casablanca to discuss political and military strategy. There are disagreements, though. Some of the Americans push for an invasion of Western Europe as soon as possible, while the British are more cautious and want to strike on the supposedly softer Mediterranean front. The debates are bitter, and U.S. generals are divided since some fear the U.S. doesn't yet have enough strength to sustain a full-on invasion. By the end of the conference, the Western Allies agreed on their plan for 1943 and beyond. They would attack Sicily as soon as possible and delay the invasion of France until 1944. They would intensify and coordinate the bombing campaign against Germany, and they would double the proportion of Allied forces in the Pacific. The Brits and Americans were frustrated with the compromises, but Stalin was angry since he wanted an invasion of France within months. Roosevelt, perhaps out of frustration, announced the Allies would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender from Germany, Italy, and Japan. This statement will become controversial, and debates still rage as to whether it stiffens Axis resistance or whether Roosevelt hopes to delay peace talks until the U.S. was in a stronger position. In any case, before any of the Allied plans can happen, there is an immediate need to finish off the Axis presence in North Africa. Luckily for Rommel, Montgomery's pursuit is slow. By prioritizing fuel deliveries for the best German units, most panzer divisions can limp across the Tunisian border. Italian troops lacking vehicles are not so lucky, and the British take many prisoners. On January 23, 1943, the British captured Tripoli, while to the west, the British First Army, including the US I Corps and French XIX Corps, approached from the Tunisian-Algerian border. Meanwhile, the Italian Navy and the Luftwaffe moved reinforcement into Tunisia, some via the massive Messerschmitt 323 transport planes. There they joined German General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army. Together with Rommel's Panzer Army, the Axis have 104,000 German and 74,000 Italian troops in or around Tunisia by late January 1943. However, both panzer armies are under-equipped, and Rommel's force has lost 2/3 of its tanks and half-tracks and nearly all of its artillery in its retreat. However, around 800 Luftwaffe aircraft can provide local air superiority. Tunisia promises a different kind of North African combat than the open deserts of Libya. Here there are mountain ridges, narrow passes, and vast salt marshes, making maneuver and rapid advance difficult. Although cornered, the Axis troops still posed a threat to the spread-out Allies and prevented the rapid capture of the ports in late 1942. So Allied troops set up positions along the East Dorsale Mountains. Eisenhower requests permission to drive a wedge between von Arnim and Rommel, but his British colleagues think the plan is too ambitious and want to wait for Montgomery's arrival. British officers also have reservations about the inexperienced Americans. Many U.S. officers had never seen combat, and major maneuvers in 1941 showed deficiencies in senior leadership, tactics, and infantry training. Although retraining corrected some issues, Eisenhower himself notes that some of his officers were complacent. Rommel has already dismissed U.S. troops as Britain's Italians. The Axis wants to strike the Allies in the west before Montgomery's estimated arrival in the east in early March. Von Arnim's forces already had some success against U.S. and French troops, and he was confident he could deliver a serious blow in southern Tunisia. The dual operations also have no definitive end. Instead, German commanders will quickly draw up extended plans based on results. On February 14, von Arnim launches Frühlingswind, with 2 armored columns breaking out of Thod. Supported by artillery and Stuka dive bombers, the panzers take green U.S. troops around Sidi Bouzid by surprise. Isolated on 2 hilltops, the U.S. infantry is unable to move or support each other. With communications unreliable, Colonel Thomas Drake of the 168th Infantry Regiment sends a desperate report written on toilet paper. Enemy surrounds 2nd Battalion located on Miti Lesuda. Shelled, dive-bombed, and tank attack. Germans have absolute superiority, ground and air, attempting to hold my CP position. Unless help from air and armor comes immediately, infantry will lose immeasurably. But U.S. forces are scattered around the region, and his commander Eugen Lloyd Fredendall is over 100 kilometers away in Tebessa. On February 15, Shermans and Stuarts of the 1st Armored Combat Command A attempted to counterattack the experienced German panzers, but the result is a slaughter. Airburst artillery forces the U.S. tank commanders into their turrets, reducing their visibility and speed. Kurt Wolff recalls the results. Scarcely had the first shells left our guns than the first 3 enemy tanks were on fire. Soon there were at least 15 burning tanks ahead of us, and the remaining enemy tanks had retreated. The battalion commander, laughing like a boy, went from company to company asking us and himself too, "Did you ever see anything like that?" Kelly 206. The panic withdrawal turns into a rout, with U.S. troops fleeing their positions. Meanwhile, Rommel's troops launch Operation Morgenluft, but find their main target of Gafsa already abandoned. But instead of ruthlessly pursuing the fleeing Americans, the Axis units advance cautiously, giving the U.S. troops time to take up new positions on the western dorsales. Rommel, who was still overseeing the final elements of the Libyan evacuation, quickly relocates to take command of the next stage. The success of Frühlingswind and Morgenluft reinvigorates Rommel. He now develops an ambitious plan to surround Allied forces in western Tunisia. Rommel thinks if he gets command of all of von Arnim's armor, including heavy Tiger tanks, he can punch through Kasserine Pass and capture the U.S. supply depot and headquarters at Tebessa. Once resupplied with captured fuel, he could then strike 225 kilometers to bound on the Algerian coast, encircling the entire Allied force. He eagerly sends the plan to Kesselring and the Italian Commando Supremo. But von Arnim is against the idea. Instead, he wants to keep his panzers for a conservative operation towards the British depot at Le Kef. Although unlikely to completely defeat the Allies in the west, this will cripple them for the foreseeable future, allowing a stronger defense against Montgomery when he arrives. The result is a compromise. Rommel gets von Arnim's panzers but must use them to strike towards Le Kef. Rommel's Operation Sturmflut is set for February 19. 2 main columns would strike towards mountain passes at Kasserine and the Spiba Gap, and Rommel would reinforce whichever thrust produced the most results. But Rommel wasn't happy with this compromise, as he later revealed in his memoirs. At other times, our higher authorities were so wildly over-optimistic that they hardly knew what to demand of us next. Now, however, when a little boldness was required, it lacked the guts to give a wholehearted decision. Kelly 229 guarding Kasserine is a weak U.S. force under Colonel Alexander Stark. His cryptic orders from Fredendall reference a stubborn and costly last stand from the U.S. Civil War. Go to Kasserine right away and pull a Stonewall Jackson. City under 94, but Stark's men are mostly construction troops and have never seen action. They struggle to build a hasty defensive line. They do plant 3,000 mines, but simply lay many of these on the road. The Americans do have help from a horse-drawn French battery of 75mm guns, but powerful Allied armor reserves stay at the rear to avoid a repeat of the Sidi Bouzid disaster. At first, Rommel tries to force the pass with a decisive strike through the valley, but French artillery and U.S. machine guns push back the attackers. German commanders order panzer grenadiers to scale the heights on either side of the pass and clear out U.S. infantry. Both attacks start with some success, but a lack of air support and artillery means the Germans soon retire. Still, although the defense largely holds, Axis troops are slowly advancing. Fredendall even prepares to abandon his HQ at Tebessa. Meanwhile, the German strike against Spiba is doing poorly. British and U.S. anti-tank guns repel the attack, and Rommel decides to focus on Kasserine, including the newly arrived Nebelwerfer rocket artillery. Late on February 20, U.S. troops abandon their positions, leaving their armor unsupported. Do you like it? Kindly give your valuable response in our comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting and informative